Magic sparks, and you might come past across the six ball chick flinging off ice spots with a shot. You thought that scan is gone. She may be a lady, Katie, past the Christy, cool as the AC, the ice princess, no ready to finish. She grabbing like a dime in the spot, but she take Chris. Wnba is sparking, living the best, they don't say.
All right, and good evening, WNBA and LA Sparks fans, and welcome in to the LA Sparks 365 Network, your 24/7 365 comprehensive home of the WNBA, and Los Dos, your two-time WNBA champion. Los Angeles Sparks getting back in the flow of the free agency period here on WNBA 365 for Tuesday night, March the 31st, 2015. Good evening, folks. Alongside Chris and Mancy via the Google Hangout from the Earnhardt Studios up in Anaheim, California. Cal McClure joining you folks here from Studio 171 in San Diego. Chris, good evening, man. We finally have some moves made today in the WNBA after a few quiet weeks in the home front with some minor moves made. Other than that, man, how's it going to finally have a few moves to talk about finally after a few days off from no moves?
Yeah.
That's about it. I mean, it's been very dry, very quiet on the home front. But again, folks, even though the Sparks season has come and gone, of course, you folks can stay connected with the Sparks on Facebook, on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, on Pinterest, and also on YouTube. You folks can, of course, follow the Sparks across the social media platforms by liking the Sparks on Facebook. It is at facebook.com/Los Angeles Sparks. You can follow the Sparks across Twitter and Instagram at LA_Sparks, or pin the Sparks on Pinterest at pinterest.com/SparksWNBA. Subscribe to the Sparks on YouTube at youtube.com/user/the Los Angeles Sparks, or connect with the Sparks on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/Los Angeles Sparks. And of course, folks, on August 30th of 2015, the Sparks will plan to break the record for the highest attended game in WNBA history played indoors, with over 22,000 fans as a part of a 2015 We Are Women campaign. For more information about that game, please log on to LASparks.com/We Are the LA Sparks. We are women. We are women. We are strong. We are LA. Well, Chris, after a couple of very silent days across the WNBA home front, finally getting a chance to talk about a few moves today involving the Sparks and the Phoenix Mercury, where today, Chris, the Phoenix Mercury re-signed versatile guard and forward Wnba Bonner. The team announced today Bonner, who has spent her entire career with Phoenix since being drafted by the club in 2009, owns career averages of 13 points, 4 rebounds, and 200 career games played. Mercury GM Jim Pittman says Wnba is one of the best players in the world, and she has always selfishly put the team's needs ahead of her own. In her young career, we have already seen her prove herself as an elite scorer. Last year, took on the challenge of defending our opponent's best player every night. She has won the awards across the league's best bench player, and last season started every game as the anchor for our championship defense and a key part of our outstanding team chemistry. We are thrilled to have her continue in a Mercury uniform, close quote. A two-time champion with the Mercury in 2009 and 2014, Bonner is a three-time WNBA Sixth Woman of the Year award winner, winning it 3 consecutive years in a row, 2009, 10, and 11, and is the only player in league history to win the award multiple times in 2014. She also started every game the Mercury played last season and has played in 200 of a possible 204 regular season games. Bonner, at age 27, anchored the WNBA's best defensive team in 2014, averaging a team best 1.50 steals per game, 10th best in the league, and nightly took the assignment of guarding the opponent's top scorer. This helped the Mercury to a league best 29-5 record and to tie a franchise record 16-game winning streak, the second longest in league history. Well, Chris, I'll tell you what, man. You don't really find players that can go out there on a day-to-day basis and play the whole 34-game season, Chris, whether it's personal problems, injuries is one problem. But, Chris, in her career, man, she's only missed 4 games since 2009, and, of course, has been that spark plug off the bench, played a great season last year. But, Chris, more so, man, not just the scoring and points, Chris, how important, though, is it, though, that you have a player like Bonner that, yes, Chris, can be that bench player, but also, man, You know she's going to play every night regardless of how beat up she is. Because, again, man, she's only missed 4 games in her whole career, man. How impressive is that stat line that she's only missed 4 games her entire career since joining the league in 2009?
Very great and everything.
Tell you what, man. I mean, I know that Cal Ripken Jr. played over 2,000 straight, man, but I mean, goodness gracious, to have only missed 4 games in your entire career, pretty impressive. So again, folks, the Phoenix Mercury today re-signing versatile guard and forward Wnba Bonner to a multiple-year extension. And speaking of that, folks, as well, Bonner is the first or second core player to have reached a new deal with her former team. Last check of the moves across the league so far, only 2 players are left that have not signed with their respective ball clubs as of right now at this point in time. So, again, Wnba Bonner today re-signing with the Phoenix Mercury. Now, Chris, Sue Favor of Hoopism brought up a pretty interesting Twitter question today, but she asked about earlier this afternoon, asking the fan bases or her followers, I guess, Chris, which teams, have made the biggest splash so far this offseason. And Chris, the Sparks were also busy today on the home front. They did announce a new assistant coach today who was quick enough to follow both Chris, myself, and the network on Twitter today. But one assistant coach has been named. Former Indiana Hoosier women's coach Kurt Miller has been named as a assistant coach by Sparks Executive VP and GM Penny Toller. Again, and of course, folks, per team policy, terms of the deal cannot be disclosed to the media. The former Indiana University head women's basketball coach, Miller led the Hoosiers to a 32-32 record in 2 seasons, 2012 through 2014. And during his last year with Indiana in 2013-14, he led the Hoosiers to a 21-13 record and a berth in the 2014 Women's NIT. U of I's 3 postseason victories in the WNIT were the most ever in a single year in program history. With the wins, he is tied for the most national postseason national postseason career wins by any coach in school history. Sparks head coach Brian Agler said, "I'm very excited to be adding Kurt to our coaching staff. I've known Kurt for several years and have great respect for his coaching ability. It's been a proven winner at the collegiate level. He knows how to develop talent, and he has a great basketball mind. He will help our team immersively and prepare us for competition," close quote. Hired in 2012, he is credited with turning the Indiana program around from a team that went 6-24 upon his arrival, upon taking the reins, to nearly doubling the wins total in each of his 2 seasons, compiling 11 wins his first year and 21 year 2. During the 2013-14 season, his Lady Hoosiers set a program record with 14 straight wins to start the season. So, Chris, there is one head coaching spot taken by the Sparks, and Chris, a lot of people though were a little. I guess, Chris, I broke the news on Facebook as I normally do whenever there's a move made, and I normally beat you to the punch, and that's what normally happens though when I get the breaking news early and often. But Chris, I guess, man, even I didn't quite know much about Kurt Miller either until I did read the stats that was posted, man. So, hey, it's a guy that Brian Agler knows well. He knows his strengths and weaknesses and whatnot. So I guess, Chris, overall thoughts again, okay, not like the best of college coaching resumes. Yeah, he finished at 500, man, but again, Chris took a school that's known very well for being, a well-known basketball powerhouse, and the Indiana Hoosiers turned their women's team around, Chris, from having 6 wins to 11-21 to 3 straight in the WNIT, Chris. In your mind, man, what is Brian Agler adding to the coaching staff and Kurt Miller in your thoughts and mind?
I think probably a great depth to probably get the team back into over the hump in the playoffs.
And Chris, sadly, man, this has been pretty much the LA Sparks' sort of Achilles heel, man, is going through so many different assistant coaches year after year, man. Where this year the coaching staff that was here, Gail Gostenkors and Gary Kloppenberg, both gone for Indiana. So Chris, the turnover of coaches, man, assistant-wise, has not really been something to really hang your hat on, Chris, because we know that Kurt Miller's on, Chris, but again, man, we don't know, though, who's going to fill that other void right now. And currently, folks, at last check of the Sparks roster, today, Chris, before they made the move, Steve Smith is still listed as a assistant coach. So obviously that's going to be changing sometime soon because we'll see what happens during that point in time. So, Chris, getting back to what Sue Favor had brought up today, though, she had said, though, which team in the league, I guess, has sort of had the best offseason so far, Chris. And I think that everyone can agree it's been the two teams that we've talked about today and talked about a brief time last week was both the LA Sparks and Phoenix Mercury. Now, Chris, we know, man, that Phoenix, who may be your new favorite team next year for all that I know, perhaps, man, has a lot on their plate. Defending the championship for one deal, Chris, but also, man, no Diana Taurasi and no Penny Taylor. Plus, Aaron Phillips now, Chris, is with Los Angeles. But again, Chris, no Taurasi, no Taylor, no problem. They used the combined money, man, for 6 different free agent signees in the first week of the offseason. Then the LA Sparks, Chris, of course, new head coach, going international with a lot of moves, waiving Harrington and Harding first 2 days of free agency. Chris, and of course, man, bringing in Aaron Phillips in a splash move, man. So I guess, okay, we could say it's either Phoenix or LA, Chris, but in your mind, though, man, who is it and why that's so far been the winner of the WNBA offseason so far?
I think probably the LA Sparks going overseas, getting Brian Adler from Seattle, winning a championship, and making that huge splash, bringing in Aaron Phillips of Redmond, who won 2 titles, one with Indiana and one with Phoenix last season.
Chris, great stuff, man, as always, but, LA definitely is up there, not because we're homers, folks, as we are doing this network, but Chris, though, in reality, though, man, a lot of great moves have been made where, Chris, and Chris, most times, though, and I know it very well, Chris, working with the Sockers, most times championship teams don't necessarily have to rebuild a whole lot because you already have that team chemistry, already locked up in a bottle. It's it's like you're catching lightning in a bottle, Chris. Where sometimes, though, the team chemistry gets a little bit disrupted when you bring in new players, Chris. And again, man, the Mercury brought in 6 different players in the first 2 days of free agency, Chris. They brought in 3 players one day, 3 more the next day, man. So there's been a lot going on, with those 2 teams, Chris. Also, man, I'll say that maybe, Chris, Chicago is also a winner here, man, for bringing Cappy Pondexter back home to New York, to Chicago, where of course Epiphany Prince went back home to New York, so a lot happened there. The Liberty, Chris, they're sort of, up and down because we know, man, Bill Lambier fired, brought back 3 days later. Candace Wiggins goes and signs with New York. So, man, a lot of teams have made some moves, but we'll throw it out there to you folks to rekindle Sue Favor's question. In your mind, which team across the WNBA has won the offseason so far? Let us know on Twitter, at LASparks365, at CalMac3, or a new handle, at LASparksFan30. On Twitter with your responses to our question of the evening. Again, which team so far has won the WNBA offseason in regards to moves that they have made at this point in time. Chris, over on the college side, Chris, our Final Four is set for the 2015 NCAA Division I Women's Basketball Final Four, Chris, between Maryland, UConn, Notre Dame, and South Carolina. But, Chris, in a WNBA connection, Chris, the legendary Crystal Thomas's favorite player of all time, the one and only Dawn Staley, Chris, is the first WNBA player turned head coach to guide a college team to the Final Four. And, of course, Chris, what Dawn has meant to not just the WNBA, Chris, but, of course, the women's basketball game for her tremendous career across so many different, across the platforms at this point in time. And Chris, actually, I was a bit wrong here. Kim Mulkey was also the first one to actually scratch that, folks. Dawn Staley joins Kim Mulkey as being the as people who have both played and coached teams in the women's Final Four. Chris, it's tough, man, to sort of be a former athlete, Chris, like I am, and then try and be a coach or GM, Chris. It's a tough transition, man, for a former player. I mean, Chris, I know this very well, man, because I coach baseball. It's a tough transition to go from playing the game to then showing off your skills and trying to teach other people how to play your sport, Chris, or to teach to get them better, man. So I guess, Chris, with Dawn Staley, man, what can you say, Chris, about her being a former player, a tremendous ambassador for the women's basketball game, Chris? Now, man, now, man, she's had success on the court, but now, Chris, having success off of it too now, and of course, guiding the Gamecocks to the Final Four this year in the women's national tournament.
Wait, what?
Well, I guess what could you say about seeing Dawn Staley, again, Chris, who had so much success during her playing career, as a player, and now, Chris, that she's a coach now, but also having the same amount of success that she had when she was playing, in college and in the pros.
It's very great that she's having that same success that she had in the NBA in her college coaching days.
And again, Chris, like I said, man, it's a very tough transition for any former player, Chris. I mean, you can look at Derek Fisher, Jason Kidd, Penny Toller, Chris. It's a tough transition to go from playing on the floor to going in the front office somewhere else. Now, Chris, there's been a lot of controversy, Chris, involving the Final Four for the men's tournament, and also, Chris, involving the Indiana Fever and the Pacers in the state of Indiana, Chris, because of the controversial bill that's been going around, signed by Indiana Governor Mike Pence, Chris, that would basically, Chris, discriminate against anyone who's gay or lesbian. Chris, I have an upcoming interview very soon with Indiana Fever player Lashia Clarendon, who used to play at California, at Cal Berkeley, man. And she has been outraged at this entire story. And, Chris, I know that there's been a lot of stuff, Chris. And I know, man, that you know me well, Chris. I hate mixing political stuff with the sports world, Chris. But this issue, though, man, impacts the WNBA and the NBA, Chris, in a very big way, because there has been travel bans, Chris, put on in California, even in San Diego, where our mayor says you can't go to Indiana because of his bill, Chris. Chris, remember, man, we talked about another bill in Arizona earlier on the network last year in regards to the same sort of stuff, man, where it's religious / your sexual orientation, Chris. And I know that you know me well, man. You've known me for 3 years that I absolutely hate mixing in, the political stuff with the sports world. But Chris, this one though, man, does impact, a team in the, one of our friends in the league. It does impact the Fever, Chris, because there are a few players, including my interview subject in a few weeks, Chris. One of my interview guests coming up, Lashia Clarendon from Cal, who is a LGBT supporter, Chris. So I guess, Chris, I know that you're also a big, news guy like I am, Chris. Your thoughts about this, man, because I know we talked about this once already, Chris. Your thoughts on this whole thing or what? Because Chris, this is starting to get really out of control, man, that we're starting to put these kind of sanctions on, our own flesh and blood now across, not just in the sports world, Chris, but even in the regular general public now, man. What are your thoughts on this whole thing?
It's very terrible.
Chris, I mean, I think that's the perfect word to say here. If we were off air, man, we would be screaming and gloating and, ripping people's heads off, man, because, man, this is the second time that there's been a state that has sent this sort of bill across their state floor. And also, Chris, to no avail, it's also 2 states with 2 WNBA teams who have 2 players, notably, that are LGBT supporters. That would be the Mercury with Brittany Griner, and now the Fever, Chris, with Lashia Clarendon, who's going to be an interview subject of mine on Cal's Corner in a couple weeks. So, Chris, I just, I don't get this, man. I mean, there's so many things that I just don't see going right here, man. And Chris, I guess, man, what is your thought, though, about seeing other cities, other states saying, boycott Indiana because of his bill, Chris? Because down here, man, if I wanted to go to Indianapolis, Chris, I can't do that. I mean, a buddy of mine that works at a radio station, Chris, he has to go to the Final Four in Indianapolis to work it for radio, Chris. And now that this is in place, man, it's sort of like, what can you do about this, I guess, is my thought, Chris. And also, man, also, your thoughts, though, too, Chris, about seeing other cities and towns and states, Chris, taking action, too, about saying, hey, don't go to Indiana because of his bill. What are your thoughts about seeing that, too?
It's very terrible and everything right now.
Very troublesome, to say the least, Chris, and hopefully that they can get that fixed. But, Chris, the Fever and the Pacers, folks, by the way, the Fever and Pacers did issue a statement a few days ago about the situation, saying that they do not, of course, Chris, they don't support the bill, and that that they still will welcome anyone with open arms to their home games. And, Chris, that was the same deal we were talking about back in May of last year, where we were talking about, how the Cardinals and the Diamondbacks, the Suns and Mercury, Chris, had all said that we don't support, Governor Brewer's bill about, that state legislation about, about LGBT rights, Chris. So, Chris, it's one deal, man, that we talk about Taurasi sitting out the season, how it's going to have a negative effect on the game. Chris, if more and more states start passing these sort of, loopholes and bylaws about someone's sexual orientation, Chris, it's going to have a bigger effect, though, too, on the female athletes going forward that are LGBT, Chris, that they can't express themselves because of their sexual orientation, because, Chris, these bills, man, have so much mumbo jumbo, man, where they can't even go and get food, for heaven's sakes, because Chris, they can be asked flat out if they're gay or not, and if they say they are, they can refuse service to them, Chris, and it's absolutely a bunch of nonsense. We'll leave it here and move on from here, but again, folks, as you know, a lot be going on with the state of Indiana, of course, with their very controversial new law in place in regards to basically questioning anyone's sexual orientation almost, which I think is totally bogus, I think like Chris does as well. So we'll just leave that there at this point in time. With that, folks, we'll take a quick timeout, and we'll be coming back at the bottom of the hour with the #1 show on the network. You know it very well. Chris sort of loves it, I think, after the night. Sparks Fam is coming up next. So, with that in mind, get ready to send in those tweets, IG photos, emails, and live Q&A. That is all coming up at the bottom half of the hour, coming up here in about 9 minutes or so. With that, we'll take a break and come back right here on your home for the WNBA and LA Sparks, your 24/7, 365 comprehensive home for the WNBA and your two-time WNBA champion LA Sparks. More to come after the break here on LAS 365 with Sparks Fam coming up next.